Mr Speaker.
Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, there is absolutely no doubt that the education legislation in New Zealand does need to be modernised, it does need to be streamlined, and it does need to be simplified. It needs to be less prescriptive, and certainly the education legislation needs to be consolidated. Of course, this legislation, the bill being brought before the House by the Minister, does none of those things. It doesn't actually deliver on that. We will end up with no fewer acts governing the education sector now, at the end of this, than we have now. And it is a missed opportunity. We do need to streamline and simplify the Education Act, and we need to remove a lot of the red tape and restriction that currently wraps up our education system. This bill, far from doing that, actually adds more. It makes the law more prescriptive, it puts more constraints around what schools can and can't do, and I think that this is an opportunity that has been completely missed. I do want to deal with some of the smaller provisions in the bill before I get on to what I think are some of the more substantial ones. The Minister mentioned school hours. Now, school hours is one of those topics which I think people look at it and think, in theory, yeah, it's a good idea, give schools more flexibility. But actually think through the practical implications of this, and you do start to uncover some difficulty. Parents who have kids at multiple schools and at multiple ages would actually find it quite difficult, or may find it quite difficult, to have those kids starting and finishing school at different times of the day. So while it might sound nice and easy and simple in theory, in practice, this could have significant implications for parents that haven't necessarily been thought through. And I think that's the first thing. Principals running multiple schools. In theory, you think, well, particularly in the case of very small schools, would it make sense to have one principal overseeing the management of more than one school? And you think, okay, in theory, yes, maybe there's some merit to that. But where they are reporting to multiple boards of trustees, where does the ultimate accountability lie? Who can sack that principal if a principal is reporting to multiple different employers? What happens if one of the employers has a difficulty with them, but the others quite like them? It potentially sets up a whole heap of conflicts for the boards and for the principals, and potentially undermines the entire model that we have. Now, there are certainly issues with the legislative model that we have around how schools are governed and run in New Zealand. It doesn't adequately promote cooperation amongst schools and collaboration amongst schools, and we do need to deal with that. But I'm not sure that giving principals in isolation the power to run more than one school without dealing with many of the other issues that hinder collaboration is necessarily going to deal with that particular problem. In terms of the expansion of home-based ECE services to allow them to provide out-of-school care, I think the first question we've got to ask is, how satisfied can we be as taxpayers and the parents of the kids who are attending those services that they are getting a quality outcome as a result of sending their kids to home-based early childhood education? And the reality is they can't be, because there isn't any research. No research has been done to assess the quality of home-based early childhood education, and it is one of the fastest growing parts of the early childhood education system. There's no research has been done to assess the quality of the outcomes from home-based compared to centre-based early childhood education. Now, I've visited home-based services. There is no doubt that there are some really innovative and interesting things happening within the home-based sector, but there are also some cowboy cut-price operators who aren't doing a good job of educating kids in home-based. And I think until we get that particular issue sorted out, why massively expand the remit of the home-based sector? So we'll be looking at that very closely. But then I want to turn to the amendments around charter schools, because this bill massively expands the potential number of operators of charter schools in a way that again confuses the accountability mechanism. We already know that charter schools are less accountable than state schools. They have less scrutiny applied to them than state schools. They are not covered by the Official Information Act. So let's deal with the first change. The first change is that the government want to allow tertiary education institutions to set up and operate charter schools. But of course, those tertiary education institutions would no longer be covered by the Official Information Act and the Ombudsman insofar as the operations of charter schools go. So potentially here we have a state institution setting up a charter school that would then have less scrutiny applied to it than the institution itself or the comparable school down the road, despite the fact that it is a 100% owned and operated and funded taxpayer operation. There would be no scrutiny over that charter school under the Official Information Act or through the Ombudsman's Act, and that of course is wrong. If the government is so comfortable with the way charter schools are operating, why are they being so secretive about it? Why won't they release all the information? Why won't they have them covered by the Official Information Act and the Ombudsman's Act? And Hiki Parata screeches that they are more accountable. That is absolute nonsense. If that was true, why is it that after nearly 2 years of operation, she is still sitting on massive amounts of information that she will not release about the operation of charter schools and the complaints that there have been from parents about the operation of those charter schools? Because there have been multiple complaints from parents about the operation of the charter schools, and the government simply sit on that information and choose to ignore it. And of course the tertiary education system aren't without fault themselves, so they're going to allow tertiary education institutions, some of whom have been enrolling their own staff in their tertiary education courses in order to boost their numbers. The government's response to that is to say, well, let's let them operate some charter schools as well. Their tertiary education system full of rorts, and the government wants to expand the potential for more rorts in the education system by allowing them to operate charter schools as well, and that is simply wrong. And it's no wonder that they don't want them to be covered by the Official Information Act when they're opening up massive loopholes that will allow for more and more rorting of the system. And let's deal with another aspect of the charter school system. If they are so successful, why is it in this legislation that the government are proposing that they would allow charter schools to contract out of the very education provision that they are set up to provide? So let's be clear what this bill does. This bill allows a charter school to go to a state school and pay the state school to provide the education that the charter school was supposed to provide in the first place. So what on earth is the point of the middleman? Why pay for a charter school to deliver education that they then contract out to the state school? Why not give the money directly to the state school instead of having for-profit charter schools creaming the money off the top, which is what this very bill allows them to do. It is an extension of the powers that charter schools have to opt out of the education provision that they are being contracted by the government to provide. So if the government think that charter schools are doing so well, why is it that they want to allow them to opt out of the responsibilities they have to provide education? Why is it that they don't want them to be scrutinised under the Official Information Act? Why is it that they want to hide their activities from the jurisdiction of the Ombudsman? Not that I have a lot of faith in that particular organisation after the events of today. Why is it that they are so secretive about the operation of charter schools? There really isn't a lot of justification for this extension. The only justification they have is that they couldn't get enough people, and they say so in the regulatory impact statement. They couldn't get enough people wanting to operate charter schools. So in their desperation to get more of them set up, they're now going to go to tertiary education providers and say, please set up charter schools, because it's turning into such a disaster for the government. They have had problem after problem. And of course, what was the ideology behind charter schools? Well, if they fail, they'll close them down. That's what John Key said. They've had a massive failure of a charter school with drug use, absenteeism, high staff turnover, student failure, students dropping out. And what did they do? Oh, we better give them a bit more time. Well, how many more kids have to have their futures ruined by that charter school before the Hiki Parata will step in and live up to the promise that John Key made that failing charter schools will be closed down? How many more kids? Because there have already been plenty of kids who have had their futures ruined by that school, and there shouldn't be more. And so they can stand over there with their crocodile tears about it. These are real kids, and they are ruining their futures by allowing them to attend that school that is absolutely failing. And if they were sincere in what they are saying, they would close that school down, which is what John Key said they were going to do, and it's what the Ministry of Education recommended to Hiki Parata. They said that the case was already there for the government to close that school down because it was failing, and for whatever reason, Hiki Parata decided to do her own thing, ignore that advice, and leave that school open. So charter schools aren't more accountable. There is no justification for expanding charter schools. This is a bad piece of legislation. While there are good aspects to it, the negatives outweigh the positives, and we'll be voting against it.
I call Dr.